My name is Lily, and I'm 32 years old. 2 months ago, I buried my husband David, the quiet, brilliant center of my universe. This morning, I sat in a sterile courtroom listening to my own parents describe the man I loved as a failure, a dead weight, a sweet but ambitionless man who had held me back. They smirked as they said it, confident in their judgment, believing they were there to save me from the remnants of my poor life choices. What they didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the judge was about to clear her throat, look down at a file in front of her, and announce my husband's real title, a title that would not only silence them, but would unravel every lie they had ever built their world upon. If you've ever felt like you were the only one who could see the true worth of someone you love, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. And before I tell you how this unbelievable day unfolded, please hit that like button and subscribe. You're going to want to see how a story of quiet love and hidden genius can become the ultimate vindication. Before David, my life was a carefully curated painting designed to please my parents, Mark and Eleanor Peterson. I was their good daughter, the art historian, with a respectable degree from a prestigious university. I followed the path they laid out, a path paved with polite society, sensible choices, and the relentless pursuit of status. My world was beige, elegant, and profoundly empty. I spent my days in the quiet, hallowed halls of the City Museum, a place my parents approved of because it sounded impressive at their dinner parties. My job was my only small rebellion. I genuinely loved the stories that old canvases held the silent communication across centuries. But my personal life was a blank slate waiting for a suitor they deemed appropriate, likely a banker or a lawyer, someone who could be easily slotted into their social circle. Then I met David. It wasn't at a gallery opening or a charity auction. It was in a dusty used bookstore, the kind of place filled with the comforting scent of aging paper and forgotten stories tucked away on a side street they would never have set foot in. He wasn't looking at the rare first editions. He was sitting in a worn floral armchair, patiently explaining the plot of a complex fantasy novel to a wide-eyed little boy whose mother was browsing nearby. He spoke of dragons and forgotten kings with a quiet reverence, his voice, a low, gentle rumble. He had a kindness in his eyes that was so profound, so utterly genuine, it felt like coming home after a long, weary journey. He looked up and saw me watching, and he offered a small, shy smile that didn't just touch his lips but seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside him. He was a writer. That's what he told me on our first date. And that's what I proudly told my parents when I brought him home for the first time a few weeks later. The word hung in the air of their pristine, minimalist living room like a bad smell. A writer my father Mark had asked, pausing in the act of swirling the expensive brandy in his crystal glass. He was a man who measured the world in stock portfolios and square footage, a man whose own self-worth was inextricably linked to his net worth. Is that a stable profession? The question wasn't born of curiosity, but of immediate dismissal. David, ever gentle, ever unflappable, just smiled that same quiet smile. It's a fulfilling one, he'd replied, his gaze, finding mine a silent message of reassurance passing between us. My mother Eleanor, whose entire identity was tied to her social standing, and the burgeoning law career of her son, my golden child brother Ethan, gave me a look of profound pity. It was a look that said, after all, we've invested in you, this is who you choose. It was a look I would come to know intimately over the next 7 years. For my family, David was a permanent walking disappointment. He didn't have a 9 to 5. He didn't wear a suit. He worked from a small sunlit corner of our apartment, his fingers flying across the keyboard of his laptop for hours on end, creating entire worlds that I was the privileged first citizen of. He was in their eyes chronically unemployed, a hobbyist, my charity case. The wound of their disapproval was a constant, low-grade infection in our lives. They never missed an opportunity to subtly or overtly remind me of the life I could have had. Ethan just made junior partner, my mother would announce over the tense Sunday dinners we were obligated to attend. Her eyes would inevitably flick to David, who would be patiently listening to one of my father's monologues about the market. He and Jennifer are looking at a house in the suburbs. 5 bedrooms with a lovely garden for the children. The subtext was a blaring neon sign. And you live in a 2-bedroom apartment with a man who plays with words for a living while your brother conquers the world. I remember our first Christmas together as a married couple with painful clarity. My parents insisted we come to their house for the gift exchange. It was a performance, as all their family gatherings were. Ethan and his perfectly manicured wife Jennifer received a matching set of designer luggage for their upcoming trip to Tuscany. My parents gave my brother a gleaming Rolex, a passing of the torch from one successful man to another. They gave David a $50 gift certificate to a chain bookstore. "We figured you could use this for your work," my father had said, the slight pause before the word work dripping with enough condescension to fill his brandy glass. David, bless his incredible heart, just looked my father in the eye and said, "Thank you, Mark. That's very thoughtful." He accepted the gift with a grace my father didn't deserve. Later that night, as we decorated our own small tree in the warmth of our apartment, he saw the hurt in my eyes. He took my hands in his and said, "Don't let them steal your joy, Lily. Their opinion is a cage, but the door is unlocked. You don't have to live inside it." And he was right. I learned to build a wall around our happiness. A fortress of inside jokes, shared dreams, late-night talks, and quiet contentment. I did it to protect him, but mostly to protect us from the slow poison of their judgment. Our life wasn't lavish, but it was rich in every single way that mattered. I had my curating work at the museum, a job that fed my soul. He had his stories, the worlds that he built from scratch. And we had each other, a partnership so deep and true it felt like its own living entity. It was enough. It was everything. But I had no idea that a single devastating event was about to shatter that fortress, completely leaving me exposed and alone to face the full unbridled force of their lifelong disapproval. The ordinary Tuesday that my world ended began with an act of love. David had woken up before me, as he always did, and made me a cup of coffee, leaving it on my nightstand with a small, silly note sketched on a napkin. Today's was a cartoon drawing of a T-Rex trying to make a bed with the caption, "My arms are too short for these fitted sheets." It was a running joke between us. I smiled the warmth of the coffee mug, a familiar comfort in my hands. He came into the room already dressed in his usual uniform of a soft t-shirt and jeans, and leaned down to kiss me. "Morning sunshine," he murmured. He'd complained of a headache and a strange tightness in his chest, but we both chalked it up to stress. He had been working with a ferocious intensity on his latest project, a sprawling historical epic he was more excited about than anything he'd written before. He'd wake up in the middle of the night to scribble down notes, his mind constantly whirring. "It feels like it's pouring out of me," he'd told me just a few days prior. "You should take it easy today," I said, touching his cheek. "Maybe go for a walk later." "Just a few more chapters," he'd replied, his eyes alight with creative fire. "I'm so close to the end, Lily. I can feel it. Then I'll take a whole week off, I promise. We'll go to the coast." He kissed me one last time before I left for the museum. "I love you" were his last words to me. He never got to finish those chapters. I got the call at 315 that afternoon. It was a paramedic with a calm, practiced voice that did nothing to soften the blow. A massive, sudden heart attack. A neighbor had seen him collapse in our small garden where he'd gone for a bit of fresh air. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. He was 35 years old. The days that followed are a gray, featureless blur of grief. It wasn't a mental state. It was a physical one. An ache in my bones so deep I felt it might shatter me from the inside out. The world had lost its color, its sound, its very meaning. The silence in our apartment was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Through the thick haze of shock and pain, my parents and my brother Ethan swept in, taking charge with a chilling corporate efficiency. They handled the funeral arrangements not because they were grieving the man David was, but because they were managing a public relations crisis, the crisis of their daughter's now tainted social image. Their sympathy was a hollow performance. My mother would hug me, her touch as light and fleeting as a butterfly, and whisper, "You're being so strong," but her eyes would be scanning the room, assessing who had come to pay their respects, what they were wearing. My father clapped me on the shoulder and said, "We'll get you through this," his tone, the same one he used when a promising investment went south. It was the language of damage control. They spoke of David in the past tense with an air of sad, predictable finality, as if his death was the only logical conclusion to a life lived without what they considered ambition. They mourned the idea of him, my poor choice, my financial burden, but not the man himself. The first clear, undeniable sign of their true intentions came the day after the funeral. I was sitting on our sofa wrapped in David's favorite worn-out university sweater, trying to remember how to breathe. They came over unannounced, bringing with them a leather folder and an attitude of grim purpose. "Lily, we need to talk about your future," my father began, sitting in the armchair opposite me, a space that was always David's. The sight of him there sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. "Realistically, you can't afford this apartment on your own salary." I stared at him, numb. David's side of the bed was still indented from where I'd slept, the scent of him still lingering on the pillows, and my father was talking about real estate. "We think it's best if you sell this place," my mother added, her voice soft but with a core of steel. "Clear out David's things, put it on the market, and move back home with us for a while. It's the sensible, logical thing to do." They weren't offering comfort. They were issuing a directive. They saw his death not as a profound human tragedy, but as a strategic opportunity. It was their chance to erase the one major decision I'd made in my life that they'd never approved of. It was their chance to bring their wayward daughter back into the fold, to reset my life to their exacting specifications. I remember looking from my father's impassive face to my mother's carefully neutral one, and feeling a cold dread seep through my grief. They weren't there to help me mourn my husband. They were there to bury his memory right alongside his body. Their condolences felt like criticism wrapped in black lace, and little did I know this was just the overture to an opera of cruelty they were preparing to perform. In the weeks following the funeral, my parents' campaign to methodically dismantle the life I had built with David began in earnest. My grief, I quickly learned, was an inconvenience to them. It was a messy, unproductive emotion that was getting in the way of their meticulously crafted plan for my recovery. They operated under the guise of helping, but every action, every word was a subtle or not so subtle attempt to erase him from my past, present, and future. The first incident was the great decluttering. I had forced myself to go for a walk, trudging through the park where David and I used to spend hours, one of the few things that could temporarily quiet the screaming in my head. I came home an hour later to find my mother and my sister-in-law Jennifer in David's office with a stack of cardboard boxes. They moved with a brisk, unsettling energy, pulling his beloved books from the shelves, piling his handwritten notebooks and research papers into a box they had callously labeled donations. My mother was holding a collection of poetry I had given him on our first anniversary, flipping through it with a dismissive air. "We just thought we'd get a head start for you, sweetie," she said, her smile bright and entirely false. "It's not healthy to hold on to all this. Clutter. Clutter." She was calling his life's work the physical manifestation of his soul, clutter. I felt a surge of white-hot anger so intense it momentarily burned through the fog of my grief. "Get out," I said, my voice shaking with a rage I didn't know I possessed. "Get out of his office. Now." My mother looked genuinely offended, as if I were a petulant child throwing an ungrateful tantrum. "Well, I never," she sniffed. "We were only trying to help you move on." But they left, grabbing their purses and scurrying out of the apartment. I spent the rest of the evening carefully, lovingly placing every book, every notebook back where it belonged, my tears staining the pages he had poured his heart and mind into. It felt like a desecration, a violation of the most sacred space in our home. The second incident was the constant, insidious financial pressure. My father, a man who communicates primarily through financial statements and power plays, began his assault via the telephone. He would call me daily, always around lunchtime, with helpful advice. He'd found a realtor for me, a real shark who could get the apartment sold quickly. He'd had our home unofficially appraised, quoting a number with a satisfied tone. He'd even had my brother Ethan, the lawyer, look into the legalities of breaking my lease to minimize financial exposure. "The market is hot right now, Lily," he'd say, his voice full of the paternal authority he believed was his birthright. "You don't want to miss this window of opportunity." It was a relentless chipping away at my stability, a campaign designed to make me feel helpless, incompetent, and wholly dependent on his superior business acumen. Every conversation was a thinly veiled reminder that in their eyes I was now a financial liability, a problem that needed to be efficiently solved. The third and perhaps most painful assault came in the form of their endless glowing praise for Ethan. It was as if they needed to create a stark, undeniable contrast between my successful living brother and my failed dead husband. It was a cruel and calculated psychological tactic. Every phone call, every brief visit was a new report on Ethan's ever-ascending triumphs. Ethan had just won a major high-profile case. Ethan and Jennifer were putting in an in-ground pool. Ethan was taking his family to Europe for 2 weeks in the fall. "It's just so wonderful to see your brother providing so well for his family," my mother would say her words, a series of precisely aimed barbs. "Jennifer doesn't have to worry about a single thing. She can focus on the children and her charity work." They were painting a narrative. David was a lesser man, a man who had failed in his most basic duty as a husband, and by extension they were painting me as a fool for ever loving him. I tried to push back, to defend him, to make them see. I tried to have a real conversation with my mother, hoping to find a flicker of empathy. "You never understood him," I told her, during one particularly painful phone call, my voice cracking. "He was brilliant and kind, and he made me happy, truly happy. Isn't that what's supposed to matter?" Her response was as swift and devastating as a slap. "Of course he was a sweet boy, Lily. No one is saying he wasn't. But sweetness doesn't pay the mortgage. We're just being realistic about your situation. It's time for you to be realistic, too." It was textbook gaslighting, a masterclass in emotional manipulation. My grief was hysteria, my love was naivete, my perspective was skewed, and their cold, hard pragmatism was the only acceptable reality. The turning point, the moment of clarity, came not from within the toxic echo chamber of my family, but from the outside. I had finally agreed to meet my best friend Sarah for coffee. I hadn't seen her since the funeral, too lost in my own world of pain. I found myself pouring out the whole sordid story, the boxes, the realtor, the constant praise for Ethan. I half expected her to offer platitudes to tell me my parents were just worried and that they meant well. Instead, she put down her cup, her expression hardening with a fierce loyalty that I desperately needed. She put her hand on mine and looked me directly in the eye. "Lily, listen to me," she said, her voice firm and clear. "This isn't about helping you. This is a hostile takeover of your life. They are not respecting your grief. They are using it as leverage to get what they've always wanted, to pull you back into their orbit and erase the man they never approved of. Do not let them." Hearing someone else validate my feelings to confirm that I wasn't being oversensitive or paranoid was like a splash of icy water to the face. She was right. This wasn't concern. This was control. This was a war for the narrative of my life, and I was losing. Each of their comments had been a small cut, but I was bleeding out emotionally. I thought I had seen the worst of their disapproval, but I was tragically wrong. The final deepest wound was yet to come, and it would be inflicted at a carefully orchestrated family dinner designed to be the site of my public surrender. The invitation came not as a call, but as a formal, sterile email from my brother Ethan. He was cordially requesting my presence at a family meeting to be held at our parents' house the following Sunday. The subject line read simply, "Regarding Lily's future." It was clinical, condescending, and it sent a chill down my spine. I knew instinctively what it was. This was not a dinner, it was a deposition. It was a corporate-style intervention where my life would be the sole item on the agenda and they, the self-appointed board of directors, would vote on my fate. A part of me, the part that was exhausted and hollowed out by grief, wanted to refuse. I wanted to lock my door, turn off my phone, and hide in the fortress of my apartment. But another stronger part, a part that sounded a lot like David's quiet, steady voice, knew I had to face them. To hide would be to concede to admit that they were right. I owed it to David's memory and to myself to stand my ground, even if my legs felt like they were made of sand. I walked into their house that Sunday, and the atmosphere was thick with a manufactured solemnity. My parents, my brother, and his wife, Jennifer, were all seated in the formal dining room, a space reserved for major holidays and life-altering announcements. The heavy damask curtains were drawn, casting the room in a somber, theatrical light. They had set a single place for me at the head of the table opposite my father. It was a deliberate, calculated power play, positioning me as a subject to be addressed, a problem to be solved. They let me sit for a moment in the crushing silence before my father cleared his throat, placing his hands flat on the polished mahogany table, as if calling a board meeting to order. "Lily," he began, his voice devoid of any real warmth, "we've all been very worried about you, and we've decided as a family on the best path forward for you." He then proceeded to lay out their plan. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a verdict. It was a meticulously detailed 5-point roadmap for the rest of my life, a life in which I was apparently no longer the driver. I was to immediately sign over power of attorney to Ethan, who would graciously handle the sale of my apartment and the liquidation of David's meager assets, a phrase he used with a barely concealed sneer. I would then move into their guest room just for a year or two until you're back on your feet. I would take a few months to recover, and then they would use their connections to help me find a more suitable and stable job, perhaps in administration, at my father's company. It was a complete and utter erasure of my identity, my career, my home, and my independence. I listened, my hands clenched into painful fists in my lap, my nails digging into my palms. When he was finally finished, I found my voice, though it felt like a stranger's. "I appreciate your concern," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth, "but I'm not selling my home. It's my home, and I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." That's when the true, unforgivable cruelty began. That's when my mother reached across the table and patted my hand, a gesture that was meant to be comforting but felt like a shackle. "Oh, sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with a cloying, weaponized pity. "We know you think that. But you're emotional right now. You're not thinking clearly. Your father and Ethan, they're men. They understand these things. They know what's best." Then my father delivered the final fatal blow. He leaned back in his high-backed chair, a look of smug, paternal certainty on his face. "Let's be honest, Lily," he said, his voice calm and utterly devastating. "David's passing. It's a tragedy, of course. A terrible, terrible thing. But in some ways, Lily, it's a blessing in disguise. He was a sweet boy, but let's face it, he was a dead weight. No ambition, no real prospects. He was holding you back from the life you were meant to have." My brother Ethan, seeing his opening, nodded in solemn agreement. "Dad's right, Lily. You've been subsidizing his hobby for 7 years. It's time to cut your losses and move on. This is your chance for a fresh start." The room went silent. The air crackled with the static of their pronouncement. They had finally said it. The ugly, vile, monstrous thing they had been thinking and implying for 7 years. They had called my husband, my kind, brilliant, loving, gentle husband, a dead weight. They had called his death a blessing. In that single horrifying moment, the grief that had been a thick, suffocating fog around me for weeks didn't just clear. It crystallized into a shard of pure, solid ice in my heart. The sadness vanished, incinerated by a cold, quiet, and absolute rage. I looked around the table at their faces, my father's unshakable arrogance, my mother's condescending pity, my brother's smug self-satisfaction, and I saw them for what they truly were. Vultures circling what they thought was a carcass. They saw me as weak, broken, and helpless. They had no idea who David really was, and they had absolutely no idea who I was about to become. A memory surfaced sharp and clear. A rainy Tuesday afternoon a few months before he died. David had been unusually serious. "If anything ever happens to me," he'd said, taking my hand, "and they try to hurt you and they will try you open the box in my closet. Promise me, Lily. You open the box." As my family's light-relieved laughter at some private joke echoed in the funereal dining room, something inside me didn't just break. It forged itself into steel. They had made a critical, life-altering miscalculation. They thought David had left me with nothing but debt and grief. In truth, he had left me with the perfect weapon and the perfect plan to end this once and for all. I walked out of that dinner without another word. I didn't yell, I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I simply stood up from the table, pushed my chair in neatly, and left them sitting there, their self-satisfied expressions slowly morphing into confusion. The drive home was a blur, but my hands were steady on the steering wheel, my vision preternaturally sharp. The rage had burned away the tears, leaving behind a pristine, cold, and exhilarating clarity. Back in the apartment, my apartment, our apartment, I walked with a sense of singular purpose to David's office. In the back of his closet on the top shelf, tucked behind a stack of old sweaters, was a simple, unassuming shoebox. On the lid in his familiar, slightly messy left-handed script were the words, "For Lily," for when you need to be reminded. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted it down. I hadn't known what he meant when he'd made me swear that rainy day promise to open it. In the fog of my grief, I'd forgotten all about it. I think I'd assumed it was full of old photos or love letters, a sentimental comfort for a grieving heart. It was a comfort, but not the kind I expected. It was the comfort of armor. It was the comfort of ammunition. I lifted the lid. Inside, there was no sentimentality. It was a meticulously organized file. The first thing I saw was a thick, professionally bound manuscript at least 500 pages long. On the cover page was a title I didn't recognize, The Shadow Protocol. And underneath it, an author's name I had never seen before, Alexander Croft. Below that, taped neatly to the page, was a single sealed envelope with my name on it. I opened it first, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The letter began, "My dearest Lily, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and it probably also means your family is trying to live your life for you. I am so sorry that I'm not there to stand in front of you and protect you from them. So I did the next best thing. I left you this." He went on to explain everything. Alexander Croft was his pen name. For the past 5 years, while my parents had been mocking his hobby and my brother had been making jokes about his lack of billable hours, David had been secretly writing and publishing a series of wildly successful, critically acclaimed thriller novels. He'd kept it a secret even from me for the first year because he had seen how even the modest success he'd had with his first book under his own name had attracted the wrong kind of attention from my family. He didn't want their greed, their relentless status-seeking to contaminate the pure, unadulterated joy he got from the act of writing, or to spoil the simple, quiet, beautiful life we had built together. He loved more than anything that I loved him, David Miller, the quiet man who made silly drawings on napkins not for what he did or what he earned. The letter continued acting as a table of contents for the box. There were copies of his publishing contracts with one of the biggest, most respected publishing houses in New York. There were his royalty statements from the past 5 years, page after page of them showing earnings that ran into the millions of dollars. There were glowing, effusive letters from his editor, a man named Jonathan Price, praising his genius and begging for the next manuscript. And at the very bottom, there was a crisp, heavy-stock business card. It belonged to a man named Arthur Harrison, a senior partner at one of the most prestigious entertainment law firms in the country. The card simply said literary attorney for the estate of Alexander Croft. I sat on the floor of his office for what felt like hours, the documents spread around me like the pieces of a puzzle I never knew existed. I was laughing and crying at the same time, great heaving sobs of grief and shock and awe. My brilliant, my humble, my incredible David. He had built an entire empire in secret, not for the fame or the money, but for the pure, unadulterated love of the craft. And he had hidden it all to protect us, to protect the sanctity of our quiet little world. The final line of his letter burned itself into my memory. "This money is your freedom, Lily. Use it to build a life so beautiful and full that their small, bitter world can't even touch it. And use it to show them who I really was. Not for my sake, but for yours. Make them see." The next morning, my grief had a new companion purpose. At exactly 9:00 a.m., I dialed the number for Mr. Arthur Harrison. His voice was warm and kind, but also radiated a sharp professional competence. He informed me, been expecting my call. David had apparently given him a set of detailed instructions years ago, a protocol to be enacted upon his death. David was not just my client, Mrs. Miller, he told me, his voice softening. He was my friend. He was one of the most brilliant, down-to-earth men I've ever had the privilege of knowing. He told me all about your family, and he prepared for this day. The probate hearing for his estate is scheduled for 2 weeks from now. Your brother Ethan Peterson filed the petition, I believe. Yes, I said, my voice gaining a strength I hadn't felt in months. They think they're going to be managing my debt and selling my home. Mr. Harrison chuckled a dry legal sound that was the most reassuring thing I had ever heard. Well, he said, I think we can promise them a slightly different agenda. I will be there to represent the estate of Alexander Croft. All you need to do, Lily, is show up. We spent the next hour on the phone mapping out the strategy. It was simple, elegant, and utterly devastating. My parents thought they were arranging a hearing to manage my supposed insolvency. They had no idea they were walking into the premiere of their own spectacular downfall, with a script written by the very man they had so carelessly and cruelly scorned. The day of the probate hearing, I chose my outfit with the deliberate care of a general preparing for a decisive battle. It wasn't a power suit or anything that would scream defiance. It was a simple, elegant black sheath dress, the one David had always said made my eyes look like emeralds. It was a quiet, personal statement that he was there with me, his love, my invisible armor. When I walked into the small wood-paneled courtroom, my family was already there. My father, my mother, and Ethan. They were huddled together by the petitioner's table, whispering conspiratorially. They gave me a collective look of practiced pity as I took my seat alone at the respondents' table. They saw a grieving widow, fragile and alone, about to be rescued from her own poor judgment. They were about to learn how catastrophically wrong they were. Ethan, radiating an almost comical level of self-importance, was acting as their legal counsel. He strutted around in his $1,000 suit, arranging and rearranging a thin stack of papers, occasionally glancing over at me with a condescending smile. He genuinely believed he was the smartest, most powerful person in the room. He had no idea he was a lamb being led to a slaughter of his own making. The proceedings began. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her late 50s named Judge Davies, reviewed the petition my brother had filed. Her face was an impassive mask. The petition was a work of art in its condescension. A formal request to have Ethan Peterson appointed as the executor of David Miller's estate, which they had officially listed as having minimal assets and significant potential debts related to the deceased's lack of employment. Mrs. Miller, the judge, said, her voice neutral as she addressed me. The petition before me states that your late husband, David Miller, was unemployed at the time of his passing and was supported financially by you. Is that correct? Before I could utter a single word, my father, in a spectacular breach of courtroom protocol, stood up. He was too arrogant, too used to being the most important man in any room to care. That is correct, Your Honor, he said, his voice ringing with the false authority he so often employed. My son-in-law was a writer. A hobbyist, really. A good man, but with no steady income. My daughter Lily has been left in a precarious financial situation. We are simply here to help her manage things. My mother nodded sadly from her seat, dabbing at a perfectly dry eye with an embroidered handkerchief. Ethan smirked. The trap was set. Their narrative was on the official record. And then, precisely as planned, the heavy oak door at the back of the courtroom opened. A distinguished silver-haired man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit walked in. He moved with an air of quiet, unshakable confidence that immediately commanded the room's full attention. He walked directly to my table and placed a reassuring hand briefly on my shoulder before turning to address the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm, clear, and powerful. "My apologies for my late arrival. My name is Arthur Harrison. I am the attorney for the estate of the deceased Mr. David Miller." My family stared at him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and annoyance. Why would a broke, unemployed writer have a lawyer who looked like he charged $2,000 an hour? Ethan's smug smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "There seems to be a slight but significant error in the petition regarding the deceased's occupation." Mr. Harrison continued approaching the bench with a heavy leather briefcase. While it is true that David Miller was a writer, he was not, in fact, unemployed. He was one of the most successfully employed writers in the world. Perhaps the petitioners would be more familiar with his professional name, Alexander Croft. The name landed in the silent courtroom like a physical blow. My mother gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. My father's face went from ruddy confidence to a pasty, sickly white. Alexander Croft was a household name. His blockbuster thrillers were in every airport, on every bestseller list, with movie deals in the works. My mother had 2 of his paperbacks on her own nightstand at that very moment. Ethan looked as if he'd been physically struck, his jaw slack, his face a mask of utter disbelief. Mr. Harrison wasn't finished. He opened his briefcase and placed a thick, professionally bound file on the judge's bench. "This file, Your Honor, contains copies of Mr. Miller's publishing contracts his last 5 years of royalty statements and a certified letter from his publisher attesting to his status as one of their most valuable and profitable authors. The name on the petition, David Miller, is correct. The occupation is not." Judge Davies stared at my family, her previously impassive expression now hardening into one of icy contempt. She looked down at the file, her eyes widening slightly, as she flipped through the first few pages of financial statements. She looked back up at my father, who was still standing frozen in place like a statue. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "It says here that your late son-in-law's earnings from last year alone exceeded $7 million. The room was utterly, profoundly silent. The raw, exquisite humiliation on my parents' faces was a sight to behold. It was a complete and total annihilation of their lifelong narrative, of their entire worldview, in a single brutal moment. The judge cleared her throat, her voice now booming in the small room. For the official court record, she announced, glaring at my brother, the petition is amended. The deceased's occupation was best-selling author, and the initial valuation of the estate is not minimal. Based on these preliminary documents, it is at present valued in excess of $18 million. She then turned to me, her expression softening for the first time. "Mrs. Miller, given this new and substantial information, the court hereby denies the petition to appoint your brother as executor. The estate will be managed according to your husband's official will, which Mr. Harrison has now filed with the court." Mr. Harrison gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. This was my moment. I stood up, my body feeling light and strong, and turned to face my family for the first time. I didn't look at the judge. I looked directly into my father's shocked, empty eyes. "He was the most brilliant, ambitious, and successful man I have ever known," I said, my voice clear and steady without a single trace of a tremor. "His success wasn't measured in the flashy cars or big houses that you can understand. It was measured in the millions of people his stories touched around the world. It was measured in the quiet integrity with which he lived his life. He wasn't a dead weight. He was the anchor that kept me grounded in what was real and true. You just weren't qualified to see it." Then I turned my gaze to my mother and my brother and delivered the final quiet blow. Mr. Harrison will be handling all aspects of the estate per David's explicit and legally binding written instructions. Instructions which I can assure you do not involve any of you in any capacity ever again. As I walked out of that courtroom with Arthur Harrison by my side, I didn't look back. I had closed a chapter of my life that had been defined by their judgment, but I was about to find out what happens when the entire world learns the beautiful truth they had tried so desperately and so cruelly to deny. Leaving the courthouse felt like taking my first true breath of clean air after years of living in a smoke-filled room. The crushing weight of my parents' judgment, a burden I had carried for so long I had forgotten what it felt like to be without it, was finally irrevocably gone. In its place was a quiet, fierce, and expansive sense of freedom. I felt light enough to float. The story as I knew it would broke within hours. David's publisher, with my express permission given through Mr. Harrison, released a formal statement confirming that the beloved, notoriously reclusive author Alexander Croft was in fact David Miller, who had passed away suddenly. They released a beautiful candid photo of him, a shot I'd taken of him, laughing in our favorite park, his head thrown back, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The news was an international media sensation. The Secret Life of Alexander Croft was the headline on news sites from the New York Times to the BBC. Tributes poured in from world-famous authors, from literary critics, from Hollywood directors, and from millions of heartbroken fans who, like me, had loved him without ever knowing his face. Our quiet little life was now a global story of hidden genius and profound love. The fallout from my family was as swift and brutal as a guillotine. Their entire world was built on a fragile foundation of reputation, social standing, and the perception of others. That foundation had just been obliterated on a public stage. They were not just wrong, they had been publicly, spectacularly, humiliatingly wrong. Their friends, the ones they'd spent decades cultivating at country clubs, charity galas, and exclusive dinner parties, suddenly stopped returning their calls. To have so publicly and cruelly scorned a man who was secretly a cultural icon was, in their world, an unforgivable social sin. They became objects of gossip and thinly veiled ridicule, the very thing they had always feared most. My father, I heard through a distant cousin, lost a major business deal he had been working on for months. His potential partner, a man who valued discretion and character, had read the story in the Wall Street Journal and decided he didn't want to be in business with a man who demonstrated such appalling judgment. My brother Ethan's prestigious law firm was deeply embarrassed. Having one of their junior partners publicly humiliated in probate court while attempting to legally fleece his own grieving sister was not good for their carefully polished image. He was reportedly taken off several high-profile cases and sidelined, his once bright, meticulously planned career path suddenly shrouded in a thick, impenetrable fog. They had become prisoners in the gilded cage they had spent their entire lives building. For me, the path forward was clear, laid out, with loving precision in the final pages of David's letter. His instructions were simple: live Lily. Live for both of us. Build something beautiful. With the expert guidance of Arthur Harrison, I began to execute his real will. The very first thing I did was establish the David Miller Foundation for Emerging Writers, an ambitious grant program designed to support talented, unagented authors who needed the one thing David never had: a little financial security and a vote of confidence to allow their creativity to flourish. Pouring my grief and energy into building his legacy gave my pain a purpose. It transformed the raw agony of loss into something constructive, hopeful, and beautiful. I sold our small apartment, the place that held so many beautiful memories, but was also haunted by the ghosts of our struggle against my family's disapproval. I bought a small, elegant brownstone on a quiet, leafy street, in a historic neighborhood. A house with high ceilings, enormous windows that flooded the rooms with light, and a small walled garden in the back. I filled it with art books and music. It was a home David would have loved, a sanctuary of peace where no judgment could ever enter. I started working again at the museum, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I accepted a position curating a new wing for contemporary art, a job that challenged and inspired me every single day. For the first time in my life, I was living a life entirely of my own design, funded by the secret genius of the man who had always believed in me, and wonderfully, gloriously free from the people who never had. I had found my peace, but the profound silence from my parents was deafening. I wondered if they would ever reach out, if they could ever swallow their pride, or if the shame of their public humiliation was simply too great to overcome. The answer, when it came a few months later, was not what I expected at all. A year can change everything. 1 year after I walked out of that courtroom and into a new life, the world felt like a different place. My life was unrecognizable in the best, most beautiful way possible. The David Miller Foundation had just awarded its first round of grants to 5 brilliant, struggling writers from diverse backgrounds. I had sat on the selection panel reading their submissions late into the night, and I felt David's presence in every powerful sentence, in every spark of raw, untamed talent. His legacy wasn't just in the incredible books he had written, but in the future books he was now making possible. The foundation had become the center of my professional life, and it brought me a profound, resonant sense of joy. My new brownstone had become a true home, a sanctuary. It was a place of quiet creation during the day and happy, warm gatherings in the evenings. Friends like Sarah would come to visit, and we would sit in the garden under the string lights, drinking wine and talking for hours. Mr. Harrison, who had transitioned from my lawyer to a dear friend and mentor, would join me for dinner, occasionally sharing stories about David's early days as a writer that always made me smile through my tears. I was healing. The sharp, jagged edges of my grief had softened, worn smooth by the gentle friction of time and purpose. I was no longer just surviving the day. I was thriving, building a future. The justice for my family had not been a single dramatic event, but a slow, quiet, and inexorable erosion of the life they held so dear. Their punishment wasn't something I had inflicted upon them. It was the natural, inevitable consequence of their own actions and values. They had worshipped at the altar of public opinion, and public opinion, being a fickle god, had turned on them decisively. My father had been forced into an early, unceremonious retirement, his reputation in the business community permanently tarnished. My mother had withdrawn from all her social committees and charity boards, unable to face the whispers and the pitying looks. They lived in their big, silent, modern house, the world they had so carefully curated now, a source of deep shame rather than pride. Ethan and Jennifer's 5-bedroom house in the suburbs, the one my mother used to boast about, had become a fortress against a world that now saw them differently. His career had permanently stalled. He was known in the city's legal circles as the man who tried to take advantage of his widowed sister, a stain of character that would likely never wash away. They had all the material possessions they had ever wanted, the house, the titles, the luxury cars, and by all accounts they were deeply and profoundly miserable. The phone call from my mother came on a rainy Tuesday, almost a year to the day after David's death. Her voice on the line was small, hesitant, stripped of its usual crisp authority. "Lily," she said after a long pause, "your father and we were wondering if we could see you, to talk." I agreed, not out of any sense of familial obligation, but out of a detached clinical curiosity. I needed to see for myself if a year of public humiliation had fostered any genuine change or simply hardened their resentment. I chose the meeting place, a quiet, neutral cafe halfway between our homes. They looked smaller when they walked in, older. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle defensive weariness. They looked like people who had lost a war. The apology, when it finally came from my mother, was as flawed and self-serving as I had expected. "We're sorry if we hurt your feelings, Lily," she began, staring into her teacup. "We just didn't understand. We never knew he was successful. If we had known, of course we would have treated him differently." It was the most honest and the most damning thing she could have said. It was an apology that placed the blame on their ignorance, not on their cruelty. It was an admission that they valued people based on their bank accounts. It was an apology designed to make themselves feel better, not me. And in that moment, listening to her fumbling words, I realized something profound. I didn't need a real apology from them. I didn't need their remorse, their understanding, or their approval. Their approval had been the currency I'd sought my entire life, and I had just discovered with absolute certainty that it was worthless. "I know you didn't understand," I said, my voice calm and devoid of anger. "I felt nothing but a quiet pity, and I accept that you will never be able to. But what happened can't be undone. The way you treated David for 7 years, and the way you treated me in my darkest moment, that has consequences. I established the new boundaries right there clearly and without emotion. I would be civil. I would see them at major family holidays for the sake of any remaining family ties. But the intimate, fraught, and painful relationship of daughter and parents was over. There would be no more Sunday dinners, no more unsolicited advice, no more attempts to control my life. My father, who had been silent the entire time, looked up at me. And for the very first time in my entire life, he looked at me with something that resembled genuine, unadulterated respect. "You've changed, Lily," he said quietly. "David would be proud." It was the kindest, most validating thing he had ever said to me. "Yes, he would," I replied, a small, true smile touching my lips. And for the first time I knew it was true, not because my father had finally said it, but because I finally truly felt it myself. I realized then that justice wasn't about their punishment. It was about my freedom. It was the freedom to define my own life, to honor my own truth, and to surround myself with a new kind of family, one built on genuine love and mutual respect, not on blood and obligation. I had finally learned a lesson that had been waiting for me my entire life. As I drove away from that cafe, a gentle, persistent rain began to fall, washing the city in a soft, gray light. Each drop that slid down the windshield felt like it was washing something away from me, too. The residue of a lifetime of seeking approval, the lingering sting of their final cruel words, the tension that had been a permanent resident in my shoulders for as long as I could remember. It all just seemed to dissolve and flow away with the water on the glass. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt quiet. It was a profound, bone-deep quiet, the kind that comes after a long and violent storm has finally passed, leaving the air clean and still. In that quiet, I finally understood the emotion that had been sitting in my chest as I looked at my parents across the cafe table. It wasn't hatred or even resentment. It was a deep, aching pity. I saw them not as the powerful, monolithic figures who had dictated the terms of my happiness for 3 decades, but as two deeply insecure people trapped in a prison of their own making. Their bars were forged from brand names, from social registers, from the desperate need to be seen as successful in the eyes of a world that in the end didn't really care about them at all. They had spent their entire lives curating a museum of their own importance, and in doing so had missed out on every authentic piece of art life had offered them, most especially the masterpiece of a man who had briefly been their son-in-law. They weren't evil. They were just empty. And their attempts to control my life, to diminish my husband, had never really been about me. It was all a desperate attempt to fill that echoing void inside themselves with something, anything that looked like power. My journey over the past year, I realized, had been a masterclass in the nature of value. I was raised to believe that value was something external, something you could display. It was the address on your mail, the title on your business card, the balance in your bank account. It was a performance for an unseen, ever-judging audience. My parents' entire existence was a performance. Their friendships were transactional, their generosity was strategic, and their love I now saw was conditional based on how well you played your assigned role in their production. They operated on a ledger of slights and favors of social debts and credits. It was an exhausting, joyless way to live. Then, there was David's world. His world was built on an entirely different currency. The value in his world was intrinsic. It was the weight of a perfectly crafted sentence. It was the shared, comfortable silence between two people who knew each other's souls. It was the profound joy of a walk in the park on a crisp autumn day, the crunch of leaves underfoot, a richer sound than any standing ovation. It was the quiet integrity of doing work you loved, not for the applause it might bring, but for the act of creation itself. I remember one evening, years ago, he had been working on a story that just wasn't coming together. He was frustrated, staring at a blank screen. I suggested he take a break, that maybe the story wasn't worth the struggle. He turned to me, his eyes full of a soft, fierce intensity, and said something I will never forget. "The struggle is the point, Lily. It's the trying, the wrestling with the words until they tell the truth. That's where the value island." He wasn't trying to build an empire. He was trying to tell the truth. And in doing so, he had built an empire by accident. My parents, in their desperate pursuit of an empire, had never once managed to tell the truth, least of all to themselves. They had mocked my husband because they were fundamentally incapable of seeing his worth, but the tragedy was entirely theirs, not his. They were blind to the very qualities that made him so extraordinary. They had missed the chance to know and love a truly great man, and no amount of money or salvaged social standing could ever fill the void left by that kind of profound poverty of the soul. And his secret, the existence of Alexander Croft. I finally understood the full depth of his wisdom in keeping it. It wasn't a deception born of shame or fear. It was an act of profound, protective love. He had seen the way my family operated, how their touch tarnished everything authentic. He knew that if they had been aware of his success, they would have tried to co-opt it, to claim it as their own. They would have paraded him around like a trophy, and in doing so they would have killed the quiet, humble part of him that made his genius possible. His anonymity was the soil in which his creativity grew safe from the blight of their ambition. The box he left me wasn't a weapon for revenge. David was not a vengeful man. It was a key. It was the key to my freedom, a tool he had lovingly crafted, knowing that one day I would need it to unlock the cage they had built around me. He knew with a foresight that still takes my breath away that the only language my family would ever truly understand, the only force that could ever shatter their unshakable self-righteousness, was the overwhelming, undeniable power of public success and wealth. He used their own flawed value system against them, not to destroy them, but to liberate me. It was his final, most brilliant story, and he had made me its hero. That evening, after the meeting with my parents, I didn't go straight home. I drove to the small, unassuming building downtown where we had established the offices for the David Miller Foundation. The lights were off, but I let myself in. I walked into the main conference room, where the walls were lined with the 5 portraits of our first ever grant recipients. A young single mother from Detroit writing a searing memoir, a history teacher from rural Texas working on a historical novel, a poet from Queens whose words sang with the rhythm of the city. These were his people. These were the quiet, brilliant souls he had wanted to champion. I sat there in the dark looking at their faces, and I thought about the concept of forgiveness. For a long time, I thought forgiveness was something you gave to someone else, a gift of grace to the person who had wronged you. But sitting there, I realized I had it all wrong. Forgiving my parents wasn't for them. They would likely never grasp the full scope of their cruelty anyway. Forgiveness was for me. It was the act of putting down a heavy, jagged rock that I had been forced to carry, a rock that was cutting into my own hands. It was the final step in reclaiming my own peace. I could forgive them for their blindness, for their limitations, without ever condoning their actions or allowing them back into the sacred corners of my life. The boundaries I had erected were not walls of anger. They were the foundations of my new self-determined peace. My life now is a tribute to him, a testament to the values he so quietly and powerfully embodied. The foundation, my work at the museum, the home I've so lovingly created, it's all built on the unwavering principle that beauty, creativity, and kindness are the most powerful and enduring forces in the world. I am living the life he described in his letter, a life so beautiful and full that their small, bitter world can't even touch it. I find joy in the smallest things, The way the morning light hits the pages of a book, the scent of rain on hot pavement, the sound of genuine, unforced laughter. He taught me how to see the poetry in the ordinary, and that is a gift far more valuable than the millions he left behind. Have you ever had to fundamentally redefine your relationship with your own family in order to protect your peace? Have you ever had to stand up and defend the worth of someone you love, or even your own worth against people who are supposed to be your biggest supporters? It is a lonely and painful road to walk. What did you learn from that experience, and how did it ultimately shape the person you are today? I would be so honored to hear your stories and your wisdom in the comments below. Your journey could be the light that helps someone else find their way out of the dark. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of the quiet, unshakable strength that lies in trusting your own heart over the chorus of outside opinions, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories about overcoming challenges and finding your own voice. And please share this video with someone who might need a reminder that their worth and the worth of those they love is not up for debate. It is not determined by a committee, and it certainly does not require external approval. Thank you so much for listening to my story and to David's. And remember, the brightest, most brilliant lights often shine in the quietest, most unassuming rooms, and a person's true value is only ever visible to those who choose to see with their heart.